Hello, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Welsh. I am the managing editor of the Scene Journal, as well as the stage director for the Dialogue series. Thank you so much for joining us here at the 2019 edition of EXPO Chicago, the International Exposition of Contemporary and Modern Art. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to Dialogues, presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues offers panel discussions, conversations, and provocative artist discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, and arts professionals. A special thank you to our partner on this panel, Ocula. Hong Kong-based artist Samson Young's first museum solo exhibition in the United States at the Smart Museum of Art, entitled Silver Moon or Golden Star, Which Will You Buy of Me?, draws inspiration from a song by Bing Crosby in 1933, and the utopic ideals of the same year's Chicago World's Fair. Young's film installations and themes will be discussed here alongside Orianna Cacchione, curator of global contemporary art at the Smart Museum, and Avery Trufelman of the design podcast 99% Invisible. The discussion will be immediately followed with a book signing of Samson exhibition catalog by the University of Chicago Press and a short film screening of The New Bauhaus by Open Docs. So please join me in extending a warm welcome to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for that really wonderful introduction. I feel like some of my remarks might be a bit redundant. I'm Orianna Cacchione, curator of global contemporary art at the SMART, and have had the honor of working with Samson for the past year to bring this exhibition to life. And I'm really excited to be here also with Avery to talk about utopia and progress and different idealistic views today. But first I wanted to introduce Samson's exhibition a bit. Silver Moon or Golden Star, Which Will You Buy of Me? The exhibition loosely takes its inspiration from the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. The fair's title, as many of us know in this room, was A Century of Progress. And Samson's exhibition considers different types of progressive and utopian thinking and how they have changed over time and as they were adopted in different places around the world. In particular, the exhibition is interested in how, as Samson has repeatedly mentioned to me, optimism needs to be diligently maintained. And I'm really excited that we're joined with Avery, who has been thinking about utopia for the last year on her new podcast called Nice Try. So I'm going to hand it over to Samson and Avery to give us little introductions, and I think we're going to have a snippet. We'll watch a clip of one of Samson's videos, and then we'll listen to a bit of Avery's podcast to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Orianna and Avery, for doing sort of this conversation together. I'm very happy to be in Chicago, and I thought maybe I'll just start by giving people a little bit of a context of how sort of we started working on this show. What were some of the sort of features of the fair that got me interested, and then we'll watch a little bit of the one of the three. Well, actually, there are 4 video pieces in this show, but one of the 3 animations, the new one that is for Chicago. So this show is titled Silver Moon or Golden Star, Which Will You Buy of Me? And as you already mentioned, it's an excerpt of the lyrics of a children's choral song that I remember singing as a child, as a student in Hong Kong. So every year there are these sort of annual music competitions for schools that were hosted by the music office. It's a colonial legacy. It's the office that promoted classical music in the schools. So there would be a choral competition. There would be instrumental and orchestral ones, and I was an active participant of the choral competition when I was still schooling in Hong Kong. And this song was one of the set pieces. So you do two songs as in the competition, and one's a set piece, one's a free choice. And this was the set piece for the year that I participated. And it's a children's choral piece, and kind of basically like a lullaby. And there's nothing in the lyrics or in the music itself that would suggest anything more sinister than just a children's lullaby. But I remember distinctively being sort of a little creeped out by the song. And it's a very specific kind of creepy, because on the musical surface and in the lyrics itself, there's nothing that would suggest anything other than what the song may be intended to achieve.
I think you've used the term sinister.
Yeah, sinister. Yeah, and so that was the origin of the title. However, this title did not come at the beginning of the show. It kind of came in the middle of the working process. It came when. When did you start pressing me for a title? It came when that at some point that happened.
It's true, yes. At some point we needed a
I
title.
think that was maybe right after Dada Company was started. Yeah, so there are like three main animations in this show, each of which is sort of a remake or cover version of a pre-existing song by Michael Schniefel, a long-term collaborator of mine and a wonderful jazz improviser. The first piece, the first animation in the show is a kind of strange traffic safety, road safety jingle. And then the second one is a strange rendition of My Favorite Things. And then the third piece is a collage cover version of Bing Crosby's Have You Ever Seen a Dream Walking? And also Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, the first commercial recording of which was also recorded in 1933. So those couple of things formed the basis of the show. But it all started with a trip to Chicago. So me and Orianna, you had seen, so did we meet first at the Art Institute, or did you see Art Basel first?
I saw Art Basel first,
Okay.
and then we met at the Art Institute.
So there was a piece that Orianna had seen, and then I came in and did a talk, and then we started a conversation about doing a show together, and the context, of course, is a university art museum, and when that happens, I like to dig into the archive and see what's there and what connects with my practice. We landed on two main things. There was the Chopin manuscript, which it's the UChicago Rare Books section has one of the, no, I think it's actually the largest collection of first edition Chopin Musica. So I was looking at that. I was very, that obviously connects to my training and my sort of relationship with classical music. So that initially caught my eye. And then there were also the Chicago World's Fair material, and specifically the 1933 fair. And the last project that I did before SMARTS, the sequence of animation, was a show titled Songs for Disaster Relief, which is a couple of music videos and installation that were cover versions of charity singles and sort of deconstructing charity singles and looking at them from a more critical angle, but also thinking about how these are sort of musicians, artists trying to do something good and respond to an urgent situation in a way that they know how. So how to reconcile that sort of vision that might have started at a good place, but then we, with the benefit of hindsight, we know have negative repercussions and problems that we could, of course, deconstruct. So how to reconcile those two things. And for me, that connected with the fair. And the 30, because so that, of course, you all know better than I'm looking at this as an kind of an outsider, but of the two fairs, the 33 fair is let's say the less talked about one. The more popular one is the one that happened before that. But I was interested in that fair because 1930s is a very interesting time to revisit, I thought, given the time that we're in now. It was economically very depressed. Shit's about to hit the fan. And it was also a time that I felt like it was like all kinds of different ideologies were all in play all at the same time, from the most threatening kind of fascism to sort of communism to democracy, and all of those ideologies are in play, but we are now maybe in a place where sort of we don't really think about the world in terms of not in the same way, I guess. We haven't entirely moved beyond Cold War sort of mentality, but we are not thinking. We have in a sense reached the end of history. So I thought it's interesting to look back at that era and what made those people sort of want to project relentlessly this optimism despite the circumstances. So that's a very long preamble to sort of why I was interested in the fair. And I think we have some images to show that we could sort of loop in the background while I'm talking. So the fair is a big topic, and you kind of need a little, like it's always good to have like a physical object or a site that you can hang on to when you're making a work to focus the gaze a little bit. So when I came to Chicago the second time, or was it the third time?
Who knows at this point?
Yeah.
It's been many times.
Yeah, I was looking at the library, and then I did a tour of the houses, a couple of houses that were built at the fair for the fair to showcase sort of ideal living for the next century, the houses of tomorrow. And so they were very popular at the fair. The first year, half a dozen of them were built, and then the year after, because they were so popular, the organizers built some more and started those new ones started charging people. But the initial ones were they were very popular, and you can go in for free. And so so somebody preserved these houses and kept them at the Indiana Jones National Park. And they do a tour once a year of these houses, which I cannot recommend enough. I highly recommend that if you haven't done it. The tickets are very popular. So I was very lucky that I was able to go on this tour, and I saw the houses, and two of the houses caught my imagination the most. One is the most expensive of those set of houses, which is a glass exterior house with a plane hangar in the basement, because they imagine that people in the future would be driving their own private jet, and they would park their private jet in. So I mean, not everyone, but the people with better means. So that's like let's say the more expensive house. It's all glass exterior, but that one has fallen into disarray because it hasn't been kept up, and so but they are doing something now to sort of try to revitalize that house. There's been a lot of work, a lot of focus. To sort of make that happen. And then there's another one, which is the Uncle Pharaoh house, which is the it was the I guess the cookie cutter home, but it had a more sort of, let's say, a more benevolent vision of wanting to make an affordable American home that could be built for $5,000 with prefabricated material. So these houses, they're being lived in. So people live in them, and you pay nominal rent, a very small amount, but you have to pay to live in them, you have to pay for the renovation and upkeep of the house. And I was very impressed by the way these houses not only maintained, but how flexible they were to being adapted to modern living conditions. Because some, like these houses were built quite a while ago, and some of them are not insulated the right way. The materials deteriorate over time, so it's hard to live in them. So over time, improvement has been made. So the houses do change, but so it's not this super precious object like it's in a museum that doesn't change. It's a little fluid, and it's adapted to make it livable. And so so that's where that thought came from. When I came back from the trip, I was like, I told Orianna, I think the thing I learned was how, especially when you see these two houses next to each other, how sort of like a vision or like an optimism for a better future, it needs to be, even if that vision, we know that sort of now it needs to be patched up because the material wasn't right, or it needed sort of, the design was not entirely perfect. To keep that vision as a monument, you need to maintain it. You can't just, and somebody needs to live in them. So the third animation, which is the new animation made for Smart, is called Houses of Tomorrow, and it features Michael Schnifel singing Bing Crosby's "Have You Ever Seen a Dream Walking," and also, in the house he did some version of "Have You Ever Seen a Dream Walking," and then after we did the shooting in post-production, in conversation, me and Michael added "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes" as the second song towards the end.
Shall we watch a clip?
Yeah, well, we should, yes. So let's watch a little bit of it, maybe from the second minute, and then I'll say, I'll give a little hand gesture to stop.
so hard to find a place to stop, I think. Anyways, Avery, do you want to talk a little bit about the podcast?
Sure. But I also want to, the other cool thing is that Miracle Whip was presented at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. And so I feel like it's used as this really, this wonderful emblem of hope and betterment, especially in these mundane quotidian ways. Even your mayonnaise can be better, and your body can be better. And I think Samson does an amazing job in the exhibit of talking about the ways in which this mindset that technology and progress will improve absolutely every single element of your life, not the life of your country, but the way you clean yourself and the way you go to the dentist and the way you cook and the way you live in this modern home. And so, yeah, I just went to see it this morning. It's totally incredible. And it reflects a lot of the themes that we talk about in this podcast I worked on called Nice Try, which takes place ostensibly all over the world, but very much as an examination of the American utopian impulse, or largely, I suppose, the Western utopian impulse. There's also there are white guys from all over the world. But it's largely about, I think that the thing that's very American about the utopian impulse is that it's very tied up with place, in this idea that somewhere out there, out in the West, there's a place to start anew. No one's living there, it's this blank slate, just go there, build whatever you want, live the kind of life you want to live. And actually the first episode is about the foundational story of America. It's about Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the United States, which happened way before the Mayflower. And it was basically this kind of venture-backed endeavor that was a catastrophe. It ended in cannibalism. I mean, it was a total mess. And a large reason we don't talk about this story is, one, failure is embarrassing, and two, after the Civil War, the North won and really wanted to replace this Southern, this very cruel, very unprepared, very brutal foundational story that basically involved a bunch of young men coming in and slaughtering a bunch of indigenous people and starving and getting into all kinds of horrible trouble with this immigrant story of the families on the Mayflower, and it was a Northern story. And so basically we can change the narrative of our history was changed retroactively after the Civil War. We were let's just say that it's the Mayflower, and the story of Thanksgiving is the American foundational myth, not this extremely embarrassing for-profit endeavor that happened in the South. And so it kind of just goes from there, starting, because of course, as you know, people were already living there. America wasn't a blank slate, and there has never been a blank slate. There's no such thing as just a chance to start anew and start all over again, and yet we cling to this idea. We love it so much. We fantasize about America as a place where anyone can be anything, and you can make whatever you want. You can start all over again at any moment. And I think we see this impulse especially coming in the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, where, as you said, shit's about to hit the fan. Things are bad politically, economically, and then in the middle of this, there can just be this island of hope and this fantasy world that was constructed where titans of industry would all come together, and we could all just pretend that this wasn't happening, and that we could all live in these beautiful, affordable, modernist homes full of Miracle Whip. And so, yeah, and it's funny the ways in which we still crave utopia and want utopia. Actually, something Samson was mentioning to me just before we got in here, of course, thinking about, this is a complete coincidence, but in Hong Kong, going out into the street and protesting is called dream walking, which just so happens to be reflected in the song. Have you ever seen a dream walking? And I think that kind of uprising is another way that the utopian impulse comes out in the world, which is funny because I think in a lot of ways, when we talk about people who want utopia, we can kind of laugh it off as this folly, as this kind of silly, impossible thing, and yet we need it. That's the thing that keeps us politically engaged and politically active. Even though, the name of the podcast was Nice Try, because so many of these endeavors end in failure. But, Jamestown was a failure. They all ate each other. And yet here we are speaking English in America. So to what degree, you know, failure has a long tail. Failure has a very long life. And the failure of this abandoned house, you know, like just because the edifice itself has worn down or is no longer in use, it doesn't mean that these ideas represented by the 1933 World's Fair has not completely pervaded our lives today. That when we think about the future and we think about utopia and we think about progress, what do we think of? Tech, company, like products, buying things. And that was not necessarily the case before the 1933 World's Fair. So these ideas have really long lives.
Shall we listen to a little bit of we have a clip from the podcast that we could listen to, right?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Although I feel like we should listen to the first one, but I picked a clip from the Levittown one because I was interested in that sort of house-house connection.
Oh, totally,
But
yeah. It's very similar.
Let's start there.
Every time someone asks me where I'm from, it's a bit of a routine. The answer is the same, and the reaction is the same. First, I puff up my chest, and I tell them, I'm from New York. They excitedly ask me where, and then I tuck my tail between my legs as I concede, well, just outside the city. I'm from Westchester. It's the suburbs. No doubt about it. It's where the Manhattan commuter trains go. And yes, that is how my dad got to his office, and how I tried and failed to go out to clubs when I was a teenager. Such a cliche. Lady Gaga once said that the worst rumor about her is that she's from Westchester. It's not cool. But throughout the 20th century, for many Americans, suburbia was the dream. The American dream of home ownership, your own little utopia, with all it entails.
And guess what? This wonderful home comes with appreciation and equity.
This is Dorothy Brown, a professor at Emory University School of Law. And she says suburbia didn't start out with a reputation of blandness and emptiness. Quite the opposite. The prospect of homeownership was full of promise. It represented individual security and freedom.
White picket fences, a white house, and the wife waves goodbye to the husband as he goes off to work, and she stays home to take care of the children. So suburbia is this kind of utopia if you're white.
Yeah, the suburbs where I grew up were pretty white.
So this benign language of encouraging home ownership, it's the American thing to do, is really code for it's what we want white people to do.
At the center of the American dream is some very American institutionalized racism. And this is where the vision of the suburbs went off the rails. And it makes you wonder if it's possible to forge a new path on the same old tracks. This is Nice Try, a podcast from Curbed. This first season is called Utopian. It's about the perpetual search for a perfect place, which, according to the etymological roots of the very word utopia, does not. I hate my voice. It's horrible. Nightmare. But yeah, so that, as many of us may know, the roots of the word utopia comes from a book by Sir Thomas More. Was it in 1519? I forget when it was. It was written like 400 years ago. But the etymological roots of the word utopia come from either utopia, meaning a good place, or utopia, meaning no place. So it's a brilliant etymology because it means somewhere that is good and does not exist. Which is this interesting thing. And I feel like it leads to the question, like, do you think that's true? Do you think we can find utopia somehow?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this earlier. I think there are two kinds of sort of imagination of utopia for me. There's the utopian vision with a blueprint, with plans that could conceivably, although we don't know whether we want to or not, but conceivably it could be implemented. The sort of classical blueprint utopian, but there's also utopia as a drive, sort of a thriving towards a better place or an aspiration for sort of a more optimistic place. So I guess I'm more interested in the drive than the plan. And so as an artist and anybody who's sort of engaged in creative work, I've always felt that the negotiation between like making a form and filling the form with content, and then if the content changing the form, morphing it, that sort of for me mirrors that sort of like contradiction, or the let's say the fight between having a plan, like sort of like the ideal vision of the thing, and actually the thing sort of manifesting in its own organic way. So I'm interested in the drive, but then when you're making, you have to be realistic, because if the content makes you feel like, or circumstances comes into your thinking and it changes the form, the perfect vision of the thing, you have to allow it to change. So I'm more interested in that. In my practice anyway, there are people who are like more formal, like formalistically committed. I'm not so precise with form. Yeah.
And when you say like the blueprint for utopia, do you mean about your individual projects, like your vision for something? Or are you talking about like globally, like when you talk about blueprints, of course my first thought is like Marxism, or just these other ideas of things that arguably haven't been fully implemented yet. Do you know what I mean? Like what's an example of a blueprint for you?
Yeah, certainly, like ideological sort of ideology and the ways of organizing the world that has implication not only for the individual and for other people. I mean, if you're like, but of course we are all sort of every day engaged in our own little individual personal utopia making. I mean, sort of trying to organize your own space, but that when it sort of delimits itself in sort of on a personal level is self-limiting, and the harm of it is also self-limiting, right? So, but it becomes a problem, of course, when you want to extend that and sort of get people organized under your vision. That becomes a problem. So in a way, like art is the safe space to play with that. So like if you imagine a world and you make the world through whatever practice, or people who are involved in, for example, gardening, like that sort of, it's a very sort of not limited to art making. That exercise, I think, is very fruitful, and also it's sort of world making, but it's not trying to make the world in the image of yourself, which is there's a big difference. So I think the difference is between those two things: world making versus making world, but in your image.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because something that came up over and over again as I examine these histories of various utopias, from the history of Levittown to the construction of Chandigarh in India to the creation of Biosphere 2, I feel like a lot of this comes as a central tension between the individual and community, right? Like, if you want to live in a utopia, I mean, it's about getting along. It's about just like, how do we get along with a group of people? And I think so many of us, when we think about a utopia, a lot of us are actually quietly, maybe subconsciously thinking about government, especially here in the United States. Like, how can I get away? How can I find a different system of economics or a system of representation that like is more what I believe in, that I can like buy into in a better way? And I think that's why so many utopias descend into cults, because the easiest thing you can do is just like, oh, I like this one guy's values. I'm going to follow this one person. And that's the only decision I ever have to make, and it's like the easiest uniting factor. Whereas if you're like trying to figure out a commune or figure out a way to live with a lot of other people, that just leads to like bureaucracy and hours-long meetings and the actual tangible work of trying to lay down laws where you can all like live together in a new world under a new set of circumstances. And so it's interesting. I like that you're saying art is kind of a way to try these things out, because I have always imagined that the only way that we could all live in a utopia together is if we all had VR helmets and we could all just like live in our own little perfect reality and like engage with each other that way. And for that reason, I really love that your work includes so many computer images and so many so many like augmented reality images, because they do feel like you're living in this simulation, like your own little perfect simulation. Yeah, I'm curious about why you wanted to include those elements, those animated elements in your work.
Animation is actually pretty new to me. So I've made video. So my training was in music, but since I sort of expanded my practice beyond music, I've always made video. But animation is something that maybe is like within the last year or two, really. And I like making animation because it's like the thinking process is a bit like composition, musical composition, in a sense that when I'm writing music, if a thought comes to me, or I have a sound image or a particular texture, I commit it to paper, and then it becomes the thing. Of course, it has to be realized, but that the distance between when the image comes to me and when I can actually commit it to the work, it's a pretty short distance. Whereas if you try to shoot a film, you have to think about, I have that image, but I have to organize the scene, or it has to be made in this or that particular way. So then there's a little bit of a delay. But with animation, is much more like composition. If an image comes to me, then let's try to make that happen. And
It's more blueprint.
Yeah, it's like juxtaposition. Yeah, and then the process is more sort of, you can let the flow of consciousness just sort of like, it let my maximalist self free. Yeah, so I can like really pack a lot of very condensed information into it and symbols. Yeah.
I don't know if you had any other questions or
Yes.
are there any prompts? Yeah.
Lots of questions. I'm really interested. One thing that struck me about both of these things, and I was struck so much, Avery, in the podcast when you talked about the home as utopia, but then also the home as utopia for a specifically American dream. I'm interested to think about how the American dream has been exported, and I'm really thinking about like the Chinese dream now, and then also the Chinese dream in relationship to what's happening in Hong Kong now. I don't know.
So we did talk about this because the fair was titled A Century of Progress, and of course I think ethnic Chinese everywhere have lived under the influence or the shadow of this saying of a century of humiliation. So it has that sort of resonance. But yeah, again, going back to what Avery was saying, and which I also agree, it's the dream that one has. How do you incorporate or include other people in that dream, and the kind of extreme self-restraint that needs to be exercised for those who are in the position to impose dreams upon other people. I think that it's not something that I directly have dealt with in my work, but it's certainly something that is very worth thinking about today. I mean, any kind of systems of governance and any kind of political system depend on people exercising extreme self-restraint. Due processes are only there, they could only slow things down a little bit for you and sort of buy you time. But we are entering a time maybe where that sort of self-restraint is more and more rare, which is worrying.
I mean, I feel like the salient example is, of course, the example of the Chinese pavilion at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, which I think either of you would be vastly more qualified to talk about than I, if you want to take the baton. But very long and extremely interesting story short, China was in the throes of being occupied by Japan during the 1933 World's Fair, and they couldn't afford to have a pavilion. They talked about it, there were all these different meetings, there were all these plans to do it, and then at the end of the day, they just pulled out. And please correct me if I'm butchering any of this, but basically some Americans and some expats stepped in and funded the Chinese pavilion, which in this in this fair that was all about like progress and the future. And again, most of the pavilions were from like industry, and they brought like American Can Company brought in like a little example of how they make their cans, and it was all about, you know, how these incredible Miracle Whip, how these incredible products get made. The Chinese pavilion was like this monument to antiquity. It was like this old pagoda, and it was full of these artifacts. And it was just this idea of what these Americans thought China ought to look like to us. And so it was this weird kind of like trick mirror. And I guess it was kind of deleterious to the way that Americans at this fair viewed China, and perhaps how Chinese visitors and expats viewed themselves. And I'm curious why that reading and why that example was important to you.
I think when you get a situation like that, sort of when you see this sort of Orientalist representation, it always says more about the person making that representation than the object, the subject that is supposedly being dealt with. So that year is very peculiar because it was the nationalist government was still in power, and yes, there was sort of corporate American interests involved in making not only one but actually two Chinese representation on site. And then the Manchurian Japanese government also printed publications and also projected their vision of China. And so of course, these places like the World Fair naturally becomes places where these geographical, geopolitical dynamic plays out. But in each of these representations, I think it says more about let's say the corporation or the people projecting the gaze than the nation itself. And it has always been that case, I think.
It's really interesting because it sets up almost like tradition and modern, the West as modern, and like everywhere else as traditional or backwards, and creates this dichotomy, which also came out in one of the utopias that we talk about in the podcast, which is Chandigarh, the capital of Punjab province in India, was basically set up during partition. When Pakistan was cleaved from India, Punjab province lost its capital, what was its capital city, to Pakistan, and the Nehru basically was like, oh, we have this new opportunity to build a new secular modernist city. So what do? They bring in Le Corbusier to create this basically Western style city from scratch. And it's just crazy to think that these two things are supposed to be at odds, that it's suddenly, that's creating this dichotomy where it's really like, it's quite a spectrum. And I think that's a lot of the article that you sent me was talking about that it's not, you know, there's something in between tradition and concrete buildings. But yeah, and then the interesting thing I think about your work, about your utopia videos, is that it's also the other way around, about looking at what the West hath wrought at shopping malls, at freeways, at highways, at these houses, through a more international gaze, and how those images have been refracted and sent out all over the world, that we're like, this is modernism is good, this is what you want, and then this is what it's made.
Right, there's that aspect, but I also felt like I was, sort of the mall and certain specific vision of aspiration for the future, they did not origin in a place like Hong Kong. But also, we have cannibalized it in a sense that it has become a part of the way we perceive ourselves. So you cannot really entirely label it as foreign. It becomes the way you understand the world. Well, of course, when, say, for example, a certain idea about democracy, certain ideas about commercialism, when they are imported into a different specific geographical context, it becomes a hybrid, it becomes something else. So I think with the Miracle Whip being the example, we can look at it and say, I mean, of course, we all know how it came about. It was the context of the economic hardship, but also like but naming it the miracle whip because it was whipped together with this machine that's been invented, but obviously with ingredients that maybe not necessarily good for you, but we sort of try to sort of think of that as the good thing. But then what if I actually remember Miracle Whip coming into Hong Kong, and of course it came into Hong Kong much later, and we consume Miracle Whip, and the Chinese name for Miracle Whip is Ka Fu Kei Miao Zhang. It actually uses, like, you know, it's a rather literal translation, and the way I remembered it is sort of mom salad, right, with Miracle Whip. And when it was first sort of imported and marketed in Hong Kong, it's like this foreign food that is not a local ingredient. It's supposed to be a better thing, and so that's the way it was, of course, marketed to me. I can keep a distance from it and be critical of it, but I also, what if I actually take a genuine liking to it? How do I reconcile that? I think that for me is more difficult, but more interesting. Yeah, not like the ideal vision of the thing. Maybe it has morphed into a version of the thing that is even immune to sort of mutating into a caricature of itself in a way that it's not anymore in like, for example, in America, because we're so much more aware of sort of the deconstruction and the critique of it. So I don't have an answer, but I think about that a lot, and I think that's also something that I partly try to deal with in the work.
Actually, that's a really good point that you bring up, because it reminds me, you know, invoking, for example, the mall. Like, the mall was created by a Viennese immigrant in America, and it was supposed to, I mean, it was a very utopian impulse. When Victor Gruen created the mall, he imagined that it would be, because he hated cars, he hated highways, and he missed the beautiful, leafy, kind of new urbanism streets of Vienna, and he decided to recreate it. And originally in his drawings for malls, they had residential spaces and doctor's offices and daycares, and they were supposed to be these little communities that people would drive to and then park their car, and then they would just walk, and they would be these like pedestrian paradises. And then it got completely, mutated. And he ended up disavowing the mall and hating it, and then he moved back to Vienna, and he saw that Vienna had been full of malls, and that these ideas are like, they're literally viral. And I guess no one can really take ownership. And of course now we see all these dead malls, and we remember them so fondly. We're like, oh, you know, I remember going to the mall, and you know, they were places where you could walk around and hang out with your friends, and sure, like, they were these edifices to capitalism, but you didn't need to buy anything. Like, you could go for free and hang out. So it's just like, you're right, these things all just get refracted in these weird ways.
Well, I mean, that's like being retrotopic, and that doesn't try to move, and so I don't know. So that's nostalgia. That's another thing, and it has its own value. But to give you an example, in the recent protests, one of the first event or protests that really got the public angry was when the police stormed into a shopping mall to disperse protesters. The kind of reaction you're getting from the general public, the people who are, let's say, from the non-confrontational but pro-democratic camp of the population, they were furious. And when I was talking to my friends, I was comparing it to, I was saying maybe if we see police brutality everywhere, but the similarity, like if I was thinking maybe if you would have police storming into churches to clear out protesters, that's imagine that reaction that you'll get from the public. That's the reaction that we got from malls. And I don't know what that says about us, but it's true that that is the thing that is in front of us. So we need to deal with it. And of course, you know, we not be naive, and these are not necessarily good things, and a lot of people are displaced by sort of these commercial developments. But there's also this thing in front of us. And the other thing that I want to say is that I think maybe this is the retrotopic nostalgic me speaking, but we'll miss the mall in the sense that at least in the mall, desires are compartmentalized. You have there is your candy, there's your shoes, but now on Amazon, you are fed, it's you're fed these things like an unconscious stream of sort of promotion. So there's at least, like, if you don't like that place, you can get away from it, right? There's a physical structure that you can get away from, but it's becoming more and more of the case that it's more and more difficult to get away from it, maybe.
I don't want to interrupt the conversation because it feels like it's really moving in interesting ways, but are there any questions from the audience? Lots. Great.
Okay, we have time for about one or two, just because we're running a little bit over, but I will do what I can to get everyone's questions answered.
Sure. Thank you for a very rich conversation. I'm wondering if you ever contemplated the artistic potential of utopia as a necessary illusion, because it seems like utopia has had a very powerful role as an agent of moving the history forward. And I hate to think what human history would have been like without that ability of utopian ability to mobilize people, to move them forward. Yet it has been abused, and and the dystopians in history are very real, and they have a collective bite in a real bite in the collective imaginary. But what are the artistic values of utopia as something just to be criticized, not just as something to be, but as a possible necessary illusion for humans to move things forward?
That's a good question and a difficult one to answer. I mean, I can only speak in terms of like my own practice, because I talk about this a lot with maybe too much, but I'm a messy thinker in the sense that when I'm making, as you can see in this in the little snippet that you see, or if you have the chance to experience the work, you will see. Like absolutely everything that is going on in my mind, they enter the work, and sometimes the position or the thinking behind each of these elements, they contradict each other, and that's because I sort of just allow all of them to sort of be there, and it's a symptom of the fact that when I'm making the work, I don't really have a clarity of I'm working on an issue, but I don't know exactly sort of which way I'm leaning yet. Although I'm not entirely neutral, because perception is also interpretation, but I sort of let these things go through me, and I'm not trying to change anybody's mind, which needs a much more goal-directed and sort of much clearer mind. So that's just the way that I work. When I'm working, I use it to process information. I think there are other artists who are much more lucid and have much more clarity in the work, and so for those kind of artists, they might the work might have sort of one kind of advocacy over the other. But I don't think even for those artists who are more sort of like in my mind have more clarity, I don't think they're trying to, let's say, push forward a particular view of themselves and sort of shove it down people's throat. I think the better kind of artwork is when you look at this thing and you know you're looking exactly the same thing, but people can actually reflect upon themselves, and they might even think that I'm saying entirely opposite things. And at least that's the way I work. So unfortunately, because that's the way I work, I don't think it's very useful in trying to change people's mind about things. Yeah.
Gabby, do we have time for one more question? One last question? Sorry to
Do you want to ask?
cut us so short on question time.
That's
Samson
okay.
will be around after if you have more questions.
Hi, I'm right here. I have a question. Thank you all so much for your presence and your words. My question is about the environment. Since today's the climate strike and we're talking about utopias, I just kind of want to bring the conversation to maybe the connection between globalization and climate change. It's not a presence that I see like really obviously in your work, Samson, but I was wondering if there's like a connection there with the environment or with natural resources that's sort of being underscored and maybe has a relationship with the 33 World's Fair or the agrarian impulse that's part of the American dream.
Thank you for the question. I would be the first to admit that making exhibition and making work is actually very resource hungry. We burn a lot of trees, and we make a lot of walls, and sort of we dispose of them. And so, I mean, it's a constant struggle in the same way, like, you know, we didn't get to talk about this, but sort of like working within like the system or working with capital, and it's a daily struggle. And so it's not something that I directly address in my work, but it's something that I'm aware of, and I try to sort of be the best that I can do. So when I'm making 3D prints, for example, I have sort of these, the 3D prints they made out of plastic. I have these sort of support structure material that I try to use and not just sort of abandon as well. So it's not something that I directly address in my work enough, maybe. Yeah.
Wait, I disagree. That was not the impression. I definitely got that opinion. Like, I definitely got that impression watching your images because, I mean, I just thought there was a lot of imagery about the ways that these dreams fall apart. And there's a lot of imagery, we were talking about this earlier, of fire. Like fire just comes up over and over and over again. And of course, I'm visiting from California. This is something I think about a lot, but it also brought to mind this quote that I heard, I forget from somewhere, but it was basically that like, capitalism is the oxygen in the fire of climate change, and you're watching all these like malls and these highways just like burn and crumble, and actually, what? Bill McKibben, thank you very much. And also, I think very directly at this, in one of the videos, which is about the shopping mall more directly, it kind of culminates in plastic and like a plastic sorting facility and plastic washing up on the beach. And I think it's very aware of like the refuse and the materials, be it the metal of the cars or the plastic of our containers or the abandoned timber in these houses. And I think that's extremely present in your work, understanding that these dreams, when we build them, they don't just go away. They don't just disappear. Like, we're actually producing stuff and it goes somewhere. So it left me depressed.
No, but I actually, it's just, no, I didn't mean to drag this on, but I think about overproduction a lot, actually. Like, and I have been thinking a bit about that, because I make a lot of stuff. So I've been thinking a little bit about that. I don't have an answer, but it's something that I have been thinking about. Yeah.
Really glad you brought that up, though.
All right, that is all the time for questions, and I'm so sorry. I love it when it goes over, but also it's not good for the entire program. So thank you so much for listening, and thank you to our panelists for coming. I was really excited about this conversation, and I'm glad it happened.